everyone. My name is Kritika Nair, and I am here to talk to you and tell you about the importance of studying visual processing in autism, which is a neurodevelopmental disorder, and studying the same in their parents. Now, before I explain any of that, have you guys ever thought about how Pac-Man, autism, and eyes are related? Because I have. And you guys will all understand this link by the end of this presentation as well.
First, I want you to take a look at this figure over here and see how many horses you are able to find. Now, I just want you to keep that number at the back of your mind because we're going to come back to it later. More importantly, how did you see those horses? Have you ever thought about how you process the information that you see? So we primarily use two main strategies to see our world. The first is using a global strategy, where you effortlessly and automatically integrate those four Pac-Man shapes together to create the illusion of a square. So your brain is kind of filling in the gaps between those Pac-Man shapes to create that square. And you can see the forest for the trees or those horses. Now the second is using a local processing style or a local strategy, where you take a more piecemeal approach to seeing your world, focusing more on the details as opposed to taking in the whole. So you might see these four Pac-Man shapes as being completely unrelated, or the horses figure that I showed you earlier as a random splash of brown blotches on the screen. Now, both local and global visual processing are essential to our everyday social interactions. You can imagine missing the gist of a story if you're only focusing on the details. Or you might miss a subtle emotion that your friend might be trying to convey to you if you're only focusing on her cheek or the chin, instead of putting together her facial expression, along with her body language, the melody of her speech, and the content of what she is saying to understand that whole or the takeaway message. So you can imagine that individuals who see their world locally may have difficulties with social interactions. And this is what we see in autism. Individuals with autism see their world more in pieces than putting those pieces together to create the whole. So they may see those four Pac-Man shapes as being unrelated and may not see that square initially. And this has led to the difficulties in the give and take of a social interaction, which is a core impairment of autism. So, by studying and understanding visual processing in autism, it is incredibly vital to do that in order to understand autism. But what causes these differences in visual processing and subsequently in social interactions in autism? Genetics, mostly. So we all get genes from our parents. Autism also has a genetic basis, and we've understood this through twin studies. So when one twin has autism, the other twin is more likely to also have autism when they share the same genes or are identical twins, more than when they don't share the same genes. And this tells us that autism is genetic. But the genetics of autism are incredibly complex. What you see here is a depiction of the 23 chromosomes in our body, which contain the DNA code that makes us who we are today, sort of like the paragraphs in a book that make up the story of that book. The red dashes you see are those paragraphs, or the sets of genes that are involved in making autism happen. Now, in comparison to Down syndrome, where we know there is only one extra chromosome that causes the syndrome, in autism, any combination of these red dashes or sets of genes can make autism happen. you can see there are so many across very many different chromosomes, making it very difficult for researchers to understand how autism happens. So how can we find a more optimal way of studying how autism happens? Simple, by studying how traits run in family members of individuals with autism. And recent work has shown that social difficulties, which again is a core impairment of autism, is also seen in more subtle forms in parents of individuals with autism. What you see here is that parents with more than one child with autism, shown in red, have more social aloof characteristics compared to parents of only one child with autism, shown in blue, or parents with no children with autism, shown in white. What this suggests is that having more than one child with autism might mean that parents may be carrying more genes that make autism happen, and that these genes may influence social interactions in themselves. We also now know that social interactions can be influenced by how we see our world. And recent work has used eye tracking to show that parents of individuals with autism and their children with autism look at the eyes of another person's face less often than individuals without autism and their parents. So you can see here on the left, an individual with autism is looking at the chin or the cheek as depicted by that red trace, compared to their peer without autism, where they're making this triangular look between the eyes and the mouth to take in the whole facial expression that's depicted in this picture here. So this suggests that visual processing may be a trait that runs in families of individuals with autism, which may in turn be linked to genes that are involved in making autism happen. Now, this is the focus of my work. My work explores local and global visual processing in individuals with autism and their parents using multiple methods. The first is using eye tracking to track where their eyes are looking at those Pac-Man shapes. The second is using brain measures to explore whether the brain is the engine behind that. And finally, studying visual processing in the context of a family study will allow me to explore whether local and global visual processing are traits that run in families of individuals with autism, which may in turn help us understand some of the genetic links in autism. And finally, to come back to the figure from the beginning of this presentation, how many horses were there? Yeah. So there were 5. And how did you see those horses? You integrated those individual Pac-Man shapes. You can see the forest for the trees. And finally, you used global visual processing. Thank you.